Hey everybody, this is Marianne Mohnraj with Ben Rosenbaum. Mohnraj and Rosenbaum are humans, and I've
So they say.
dragged, yeah, I've dragged Ben on to record a podcast episode about agents because I am in the middle of agent crisis. Is maybe too strong a word, but maybe not. And
Flail?
I wanted his hell something flail. Yeah, I don't know, lost in the labyrinth of complexity. And I wanted his advice on it. So, because I know he has done interesting things with his own agent search. Um, I almost feel like we
Although
should.
I might not be the right. I mean, that's funny because I have found a total of one agent.
Yes, yes.
Some
Well,
people have far more experience than I, so
yeah. Well, but okay. I'm
happy to
gonna.
be a sounding board.
I feel like we should start with why you'd want an agent, right?
Yeah,
So, because
sure.
this is a question I get a lot from people, and my students and just people I meet in the world who are writing things. And sometimes they're just suspicious, like, why should I give an agent some of my money?
Yeah.
So, what would you say to that?
Mm, well, I would say it very much depends what you're doing, but I mean, I think that if you're I mean, why would you give an agent some of your money is because there might be more money after doing that than there was before. Like a good
Right.
agent should pay for themselves, right?
Yes.
B, because there's only so many hours in the day. So I mean, it's sort of like having any small business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why should you have a bookkeeper? Well, you probably shouldn't if you like bookkeeping,
Right.
I mean, if that's really your jam, but, or if you can't afford one or whatever, but like if it's going to, an agent
Right.
will actually, well, it's also an agent is a salesperson. So they're finding you business, right?
Yeah.
Presumably. And also they're doing the contracts and negotiation stuff that you need some kind of, oversight, professional oversight from. And they, you only have one career, and an agent is overseeing many careers, so they have a multiplied wealth of experience that, you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
However long you've been doing it, if their average client has been doing it, you know what I mean. Like they
Right.
probably have seen 10 times as many whatever's or more, 30
Mm-hmm.
times as many, 50 times as many of the kind of thing that you're seeing, as you have.
This is also why
uh
it's useful to go to a therapist rather than just try to figure it out on your own.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
the same kind of
and
principle, right?
and also they are in a different position than you are, and it's
Mhm.
nice to, I mean, one of the main reasons to have an agent emotionally and psychologically is because it reduces the stress on the author editor relationship.
Right.
If you have an agent, then the agent talks about all the business stuff and you just get to talk about the fun creative stuff,
Yeah.
which, makes your, like, that's a lot more fun. So the
Yeah,
you know
they can be sort of a buffer and an advocate for you ideally, right? So,
mm-hmm.
um
Yeah.
I I mean, if you're indie publishing, right? And if
Yeah.
that's your plan, then you don't need an agent, right? I mean,
Right.
there's nothing they're going to do
Right.
for you. But I feel like a lot of people go to indie because they think it's going to be easier, faster, etc. And it is fast to get a book out that way, but you give up a lot of potential options, and so just knowing that and making that decision consciously is important. Don't you
And I
think
think
that?
it's not necessarily a hard binary either. Like
Yeah.
if you it's really, sort of like, I mean, also if you're an indie, if you're whatever kind of, if you are interested in selling your words, you're
Mhm.
probably going to end up building some kind of team to help you do that. And if
Mhm.
you're an indie publisher, you know what I mean? Because even if you're an indie publisher, I mean, it might be the case that you like doing the cover design and the layout and the
Mhm.
proofing and the, and
Mhm.
the and everything, but it also might be the point that you get somebody to do some of that stuff. And if you are with a publisher, then the publisher is doing a lot of that. But then there's the whole question of finding a publisher and negotiating with a publisher and contracts, and then an agent is, so it kind of
Right.
depends what help you need for what you're trying to do. And certainly there are people, I mean, it seems like nowadays a good, I mean, the agent is interested mostly in the parts where the agent is going to be negotiating the deal and getting a percentage and so on. So they're interested in the more traditional thing. But I'm sure lots of authors do some of both, right? They have traditional publishing careers and indie publishing careers, and you really want an agent as a partner and, even if you're doing some of the things indie. And also, like, there are subrights, so maybe you sold 1 million copies yourself on Kindle, with straight to Kindle, of your novel, and now the audiobook is still
Available.
you're not going to do the audiobook yourself. You know what I mean? Like, for the parts you're not doing yourself that you need to sell to some gatekeeper, an agent is
helpful, right? And I want to kind of highlight what you said about they should pay for themselves, right? So you don't give them any cash up front. Typically, that's important.
Right.
Not a lot
that
of
would be extremely untypical.
Right. A lot of new writers aren't aware of that, right? So they take a percentage. Usually, I think 15% is pretty standard, and then they will hopefully help you sell foreign rights, maybe film, TV rights, things that you might not have access to otherwise, right? I think one thing you didn't mention is agents have contacts, and I think that is really a critical part of what they bring to the table. And this is why, like if I see a friend who I love their manuscript, they're in my writing group, and I'm like, they don't want me to just like, I'll be your agent, because I will do no better at getting their manuscript in front of a publisher than they would themselves, right? So, so you want someone who knows your genre, and this is going to become obvious why I have a little bit of a problem coming up, but who knows your genre, who has contacts in the genre, who's able to say to an editor and sort of sell it to the editor, this book is amazing, it's going to make you a ton of money, you have to read it and think about it, right?
I mean, one should say, though, that's an ideal case, but it also is sometimes the case that, I mean, it's like with marketing. In an ideal case, your publisher has a marketing campaign and a marketing plan, and it's doing this and that and sending you out to things, but that doesn't mean you necessarily should sit around and not do any marketing yourself. In a similar way, like it's not gonna, your agent should be typically perfectly happy for you to be meeting publishers and getting to know them and tossing them the agent's way. So it's not, I think.
Do a lot of people do that though? I feel like that's really rare.
I don't know, but I feel like, I don't know, like all the book sales I have made, I pretty much have made myself, like, which is not to say that it's not good to have an agent on board. And indeed, I sort of intentionally, I wanted to avoid, in fact, when I was shopping around the Unraveling, I intentionally delayed shopping it directly to publishers because I did not want to be in the position of having already sold it and then looking for an agent. Because what I was interested in getting an agent was getting a long-term partner who would be able to do the part of the business that I can't, and be, and so there's nothing wrong with necessarily doing this. People have done it. But if I have already sold the book and I talk to agents and I'm like, I've sold this book, would you like 15% of the work I already did? Like that, you know what I mean? That's like, it's money, which isn't to say that they're necessarily unscrupulous or they would take it. But even if they weren't super, super passionate about it, it might weigh as a factor in their decision that they were like, well, I mean, it's already been sold. So even if I'm a little lukewarm on this book, I can tell that he has a market. And I don't actually want them taking me for that reason. I want them to think, wow, this is a long shot, but I love this writing so much, I'm going to go to bat for it. That's a very different setup. So, I mean, I'm just saying, having been in lots of
I don't know that I think the
hiring situations in the world otherwise. No, I mean, I feel like the Unraveling was a long shot for good reason.
You think so? I don't know. I think if I were an agent, I would have been excited if it had come across my desk.
Oh, that's what I was looking for. An agent. What I was looking for and got was an agent who was super excited when it came across their desk and also knew that this was going to be a long shot, right? And I already know, both. I've sold Unraveling. The Unraveling is sold twice, once to the German publishers and once to the American publishers. In both cases, I already had a pre-existing, like I knew the German publisher and I knew the American publisher. So it wasn't like, you know what I mean? Like it's if you're in a genre that's a relatively small circle and you're going and meeting people and you've been around for a while, like you may well be doing the. The agent is not useless, even if in fact you have the connection yourself.
Sure, but you are very extroverted, and I do think what you did is kind of rare. Certainly, talking to like my friends in Litfic, they are mostly not in New York. They're not meeting agents. They don't have the same kind of convention structure that we have with editors coming to cons regularly and so on, right? So
sure, no, that's a very different case. But I don't think I'm not sure it's so unusual in science fiction because it's a small neck of the woods, and the editors are often people who go to the cons. And even long before when I got award nominations in the early 2000s, a whole bunch of editors were like, "So I'm going to be at Worldcon. You want to meet up?" Like, that's not at all an unusual
but that's
situation.
Okay. Okay, I feel like that's again like rare. It happens, and it happens to people who get award nominations, right? But the vast majority.
Okay, but not just award. I mean, that's an example. But when I'm sitting at a bar in a World Fantasy or a Worldcon, and there's a new writer at the table, and the savvy writers at the table seem excited about that new writer's stuff, they're like, "Hey, I like that story you wrote." An editor or agent at the table is going to perk up their ears and be like, "Oh yeah, tell me about it." Like, not that that's a sale, but like, I think it's different in Litfic, but I think in the genre, like file this under the why to go to conventions arguments.
Sure.
Like these aren't these what I'm not trying to give the impression that it's a walk in the park. It took me 3 years to find an agent for the Unraveling, and then like another at least a year and a half went by before I sold it. It is hard to sell a book. I'm not saying it's easy to sell a book. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to avoid is the impression, which might be true in Litfic, but for science fiction and fantasy, I'm trying to avoid the impression that editors and agents and publishers are austere figures on a mountain who you can only ascend through this veil of. No, they're out there, at the cons, and they are meetable. That doesn't mean that an agent isn't a good way to make connections, but it's not like it's a parallel thing. You should be I'm strongly in favor of having an agent if you want to make those relationships, but also leaving everything to your agent is not the only option. It's also very possible for you to make those connections yourself.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know why we're arguing. I don't disagree with you. I think we're arguing about how frequent these things are, and I don't know that either of us really has the data to say.
I don't know. I'm not making. The only claim on frequency that I'm making is walk into the bar at Worldcon or WisCon, you will see editors. That's the claim I'm making.
Yes,
I can list you 10 of them who will be there.
Yes, but you've been in the field for 20 years, and I'm thinking of my newbie writers. They're not going to know who the editors are. They're not going to know.
I agree.
So this is where an agent is perhaps helpful. Anyway.
Yes, an agent is helpful, and So I'm all for it.
So okay, let me back up. I'm going to back up. So
I guess what I'm saying is you could pursue multiple things in parallel. So if you are a newbie writer and you're frustrated because agents are not taking your work, if you think, there are one of the reasons to publish short stories, which are not a particularly remunerative thing that, compared to novels, they're not as well paid as per, whatever, as novels often, is that's a way to have make some connection to writers to get into the space of being right. And then the writers, and you ask them about their agents and editors, and it's not so I guess I'm saying it's fine to work all streams at once. It's fine to try to make different kinds of connections and different kinds of.
I agree. I do. I guess you and I are extroverted, so I do much of the same kind of thing you do. I know that for a lot of writers, all of this sounds sort of terrifying.
Yes.
Right.
And it's not the only. It's not the only route. And nowadays, a lot of these there are different kinds of extroversion and introversion. A lot of these relationships are not in person. I'm sort of talking about IRL cons, but I think lots of people, lots of editors and agents are probably more agents, but are quite accessible on Twitter. They have a good Twitter game, and you can connect with them, or and again, I'm just saying there's a bunch of anyway.
All right. Well, I agree with all of that. I want to take a step back and kind of recap my agent experience and then ask about yours. Mine is atypical, and I think yours is too, but I've never done a real agent search. This is part of why when people ask me how do you find an agent, I kind of stumble a little bit, because I have found 3 agents so far in my 25-year career, and all of them were kind of serendipitous. So my first agent was when I was writing erotica. I had small pressed published a book with someone who I, ran into them on the internet, and they had a press. And she picked me up. I think she contacted me and said she was interested in representing me. And then basically nothing happened. I think I gave her something and she maybe sent it out, maybe didn't. She was not very communicative. I never really found out where she had submitted things.
Mm-hmm.
And after a while, it was just sort of clear that this was not really doing anything, right? So,
Yeah.
um, and I'm, I don't want to badmouth her. I'm like, maybe there's all kinds of reasons why an agent might lose enthusiasm or be overwhelmed or whatever else, but that didn't really do anything for me. The next agent was uh, someone who was an editor at Random House when I met him, and I was doing a book that Aquarotica that I had been contacted by a book packager in New York to asked if I could be the editor for this book, and I said yes. And so he was the sort of like the publishing editor who was in charge of the project. I was the one actually putting the book together, and I had written a story for that book, and he said he really liked the story, and he said if I was he was moving to agenting and after 30 years as an editor in New York, and if I had a book, let him know. So a few years later, I had gone off, done the PhD, wrote Bodies in Motion, and I got in touch with him and I said, I have a book. And this was, I have to say, for a month or so, this was the idyllic, perfect story of what you want.
Mm-hmm.
We had a 2-hour conversation about the book. It was thorough, thoughtful. He had a couple insightful suggestions for revising it. He was clearly really enthusiastic about it. He got what I was trying to do. I was really happy to sign with him, right?
Yeah.
So I signed with him, and then he sent the book to when I revised it. So I revised it, and it was pretty close to done at that point. So I gave him the finished version. He sent it off to a publisher at Penguin, or an editor at Penguin, and said, I need a response in a week and a half. And typically he said that it would be 3 weeks, but it was getting close to summer and nothing happens over the summer. So he had to do it on a tighter timeline. So they got him back and they said, we like her writing, but it's a short story collection. That's a hard sell. Tell her to come back when she has a novel. So he told me that. Then he sent it to another editor, HarperCollins, same 1.5 week thing. And she came back with, like it, short stories are hard sell. Does she have a novel? And he contacted me and said, do you have a novel? Which we had not really discussed at that point. I was like, well, I have the idea for a
Curiously.
novel.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and he's like, well, can you get me some stuff by Monday? And I so spent the weekend frantically trying, and I'm sorry if I've recapped this on the podcast before, but this is seminal to my career. So I had a hard drive crash, and so I'd lost a lot of material that was supposed to go in that novel. So I ended up Saturday frantically emailing everyone in my writing group saying, do you by any chance have this stuff?
Yeah.
And there were some pack rats among them who did and sent it back to me. So that was great. And now I back up my material
Social
obsessively.
memory.
Yeah. So I put together, I wrote a synopsis and I put together, 40 pages or so and sent it to him. And he sold it that Thursday. He called me up and he's like, all right, I got an offer, 25,000 for the short story collection, 60,000 for the novel you haven't written yet.
Dang.
It was I was giddy. I was,
yeah.
Were you there with me? Because I was driving up to WisCon when I somewhere that Thursday was the day I got the call. So you might have been in the car. I don't know.
Maybe so.
So that was great. And then that relationship kind of fell apart as time went on, and for a bunch of reasons. But the main thing that is sort of relevant here is that I had started doing a lot more science fiction, which he does. He's mostly a mainstream lit person, and I started feeling like maybe I need a science fiction agent.
Well, and also the 60,000. I mean, I don't know how relevant it is that the $60,000 novel then didn't happen, right?
Right.
We've talked about that before, but that was sort of
So that novel crashed and burned, and there was some frustration on my part because I felt like he he could have advocated better for me and how all that went down.
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
so it's, they talk about the agent author relationship as being like a marriage, and I think there is something
mm-hmm.
to that, in the sort of like there needs to be a certain level of trust and communication, and ours kind of broke down somehow. It was
Yeah.
it was like,
I,
go ahead.
no, just to clarify for the listeners about Crash and Burned,
Yeah.
we've mentioned this before, and I don't want to go into it, but just that you delivered a novel, it wasn't what the publisher you had different irreconcilable visions for the novel between you and the publisher. So, and then at that point, that.
Yeah, it was canceled, and I got to keep the first 25K out of the 60K,
And
which
you
did
and
pay
then
off
you
my
sort of
student
made a
loans.
turn towards then you kind of made a turn towards science fiction and fantasy, and that those two things maybe you
Yeah.
and the agent also started drifting apart on what
Yeah.
you thought this was going to be.
It was a big, messy thing. I think I was very burnt out on mainstream lit and big publishers, and
Yeah.
sort of suspicious about the whole thing at that point, and kind of, it might be fair to say, retreated to
Mm-hmm.
my first love of science fiction. So I
and
actually,
and a lot of stuff that you did then over the next while, and I may be getting the order of events and causality wrong, but a lot of the stuff you did then over the next while, you had a bunch of successful projects that were indie. So like you kickstarted Stars Change and Perennial and so on, which is, you know
right.
what I mean? So then that's not, that's
Yeah.
that's not so much the traditional route. So
Yeah, I think I sort of, when I set out to do Stars Change, it was specifically, I want to do something fun and light,
mm-hmm.
and,
Yeah.
not deal with big publishers. So I'm going to try kickstarting it. And I just need to make enough money to pay for the babysitting so I can write the book. So,
Yeah.
a couple $1,000s. I think it was like and then some money to print the books and ship them out. And they ended up getting picked up by Circlet Press.
Mm-hmm.
But so it actually ended up being small press rather than
Mm-hmm.
indie, or some sort of hybrid of that. Um,
But did that go through that same agent, or were you already with?
no, I didn't use an agent, right? So
Yeah.
at that point,
Yeah.
from that point on, I didn't really use an agent. And then, so I did that, and then published a bunch of short stories in, Asimov's and, all the various
Mm-hmm.
sci-fi places, Clark's World, Lightspeed, etc. And I really loved doing that, and so started thinking pretty seriously about writing a science fiction novel, and that was when I switched agents, because I
Mm-hmm.
was talking to another writer at a party and asked if he liked his agent, and he said that he really did, and it turned out that his agent is one of the big names in the field, which I didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
'Cause I don't really know anything about agents, so I haven't done like good research on this. And he said he'd be happy to introduce me. So this is part of, to go back to your point earlier about conventions and networking, this is how a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, I think, do find
Yeah.
their agents, is through
I
that
was going
kind
to say
of
it's not that
conversation.
atypical. It's not that atypical, and I mean, I don't want to depress the introverts and people who don't want to,
Yeah.
that is perfectly. You can completely have a flourishing career without anyone ever seeing your actual face, and everything could be over email. It is a profession that does allow for that, and there
Yeah.
really are people like that. But it is also true that there are different ways to do it, and that a lot of things are. It is also an intensely social community, and for
Yeah.
that is also kind of a plus. I mean, it is
Mhm.
both a profession that you can do never leaving your room, and also one that has all these social sides. So I think a lot of people end up getting their agent because it's their friend's agent, or somebody they
Right.
admire's agent, or something they ask, and they
Mhm.
or somebody refers somebody. There is a lot of that, and I think that is uh, and I don't think it's a bad thing, because a lot of those, I mean, it sort of sounds nepotistic, like if you're not in the club, you can't get an agent. But on the other hand, a lot of those relationships are very much like, I read your story and thought it was cool. Like a lot of what's happened, these are not like they went to, high school together relationships. This is
Mhm.
more like relationships that are formed as part of a career, where it's like if
Yeah.
you publish some stories and go to cons and people liked your stories and they're like, hey, I liked your story. Now
Yeah.
you already have a relationship that's even, they don't even have to be, I liked your story. You can even say, I liked your story. You can come up and be like, hey, I love your writing, and get into a 10-minute conversation, and then be like, then they'll ask, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And you're like, well,
Yeah.
I'm shopping a book around. Do you have an agent? And there's I mean, don't go in with an entitled attitude that any published author you buttonhole at a con is definitely going to recommend you to their agent, because that would be a mistake. But
Yeah.
it's not. There's a 20% chance that if you're having an enthusiastic conversation with them, they're going to be like, oh yeah, well, send me your stuff. Maybe I'll show it to my agent. Or like, well, I'm too busy to read your stuff, but I'll mention you to my agent or whatever. You know what I mean? It's not an impossible.
It is a little bit of a etiquette dance, right? And I feel like
Yes. I
writers
don't want to
often,
unleash a host of authors to go
right, and new writers,
all the
new writers often don't know the script, right? And there is kind of a script to this, like a dating script. There's a script to like, how do you make it clear that you would like to possibly have a conversation with their agent without putting them on the spot and like they have to turn you down.
I agree. I think the dating analogy is good. I also want to point out that there is a matter of levels. Like, do not pigeonhole John Scalzi and ask him to read his manuscript. He definitely does not have time. Like, and that is that would be unreasonable. It would be unreasonable for me to pigeonhole John Scalzi and ask him, even though I'm friends with him, I would go ask for a blurb through my agent. The another reason to have agents. But or publisher, I guess. But similarly, if people are roughly in your peer group, it's so much easier left. If you're sort of with, and that's kind of like, I'm really not saying you should like run after famous people at cons. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. But if you have like a circle of people where you're all kind of at the same level and you're grooving on each other's stuff, you know what I mean? That's actually my strongest advice would be, when you're a beginning writer, hang out with other beginning writers, you know, who are roughly as busy with stuff as you are, you know what I mean? Sort of in the same place.
Who are taking it seriously.
And the ones whose stuff you like be part of a scene of the, like, oh, I like your stuff. And some of those will be mutual, and some of those people will then start having success, and then everybody kind of rises together in a way, because it's the most natural thing in the world. If you've been critiquing somebody's stories for a while and they've been critiquing yours, and you have that relationship, when they get an agent to be like, hey, do you think they'd like to see my, you know, that's very different than buttonholing a stranger at the bar.
I will say, like, with my second agent, various people asked if I could, you know, introduce them to my agent, and I mostly said no, right? Because I didn't have, I didn't know their work. I wasn't enthusiastic about it. It was just kind of like a cold, it was like a cold call, right? Like, and it was like, you know, and that was, you know, I was like, I'm not going to bother my agent with some random person, right?
Your analogy with dating is very cogent, in the sense that also, please do not act entitled to anybody else's time, or you do not have a right to anybody else's anything. So like, don't go and waltz up and say, you have to give me your agent. No, if there's the vibe, if you're feeling the connection, whatever, they might, if somebody is honestly enthusiastic about your work, mostly if someone is honestly enthusiastic about your work, and it doesn't even have to be that much work necessarily, but if they've liked a short story that you wrote many times, and they are not inundated with such requests, which is often the case, and their relationship with their agent is such that they know their agent is looking, and anyway, it's not an impossible scenario. Don't assume, don't act entitled. Don't assume it's going to happen. Could happen.
I've introduced two people to my, I've probably passed along 3 or 4 things to my second agent, and he did end up signing 2 of them, which I think is a sign that I had a pretty good sense of what he was going to like. And I was passing along people who were writing good stuff, right?
Exactly. And if somebody asks you this, you know, as a writer too, it's like, well, it's sort of like, I think that's a good way to approach it. It's like, as a proxy for the agent, like, do you think that, you know, the agent would be excited about this kind of thing, you know, then
here's just, I would give this as a teeny tiny little script for, if you're like, recently I was having a conversation on Facebook with, not really a conversation even, with Tamora Pierce. She wished me a happy birthday because it was my birthday. I turned 50, and thank you. And I said, you know, in response, you know, hey, can I ask for a birthday favor? I'm agent shopping. Do you like your agent? And that is, I think, a very low-key way to open that conversation without putting pressure on them to, you're not asking them to do anything for you. You're just having an informational conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Would you, I think that you're right. That is a lower key way, rather than having all the pressure of like, introduce me to your agent, of being just like, of being just like, oh, would you recommend your agent?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
do you think, or what do you think,
right. And then they
or
may
what are
then
your agent's strengths and weaknesses, or whatever, like
right.
that
And
kind of
then
thing, or
they
would you
might
be willing to,
then offer, right?
Yeah,
Like out of
yeah,
that,
exactly.
they might offer. So, okay. So that was a lot, guys. I'm like people listening are like, wow, they're spending a lot of time on the etiquette, but it's important and it's like
Mm-hmm.
not something that gets taught in creative writing
Mm-hmm.
programs, I think, for the
Mm-hmm.
most
Mm-hmm.
part. So it's hopefully
Yeah.
this was helpful to you. All right. So I will finish my little recap. My third agent is, as I said, a big sci-fi agent. I mean, his name's Russ Galen, and it's no secret. He's a great guy. I signed with him and then got cancer. So that was a little unfortunate
Yeah.
because I then like had a year to close to 2 years when I wasn't really writing. And then when I finally started writing again, I did a little cancer romance just to get it out of
Which
my
is
system,
great.
right? Thank
Great
you.
cancer romance called Perennial.
Thank you. But then I tried to write a big science fiction book of the kind that he does. Um, and I spent, I don't know, a year or two writing it. I gave it to him. He read it, and then he kind of came back to me with, I like many things about it, but your plot is broken. And then then conversations ensued after that and whatever. So,
I mean, we actually, this points out that we missed one of the most important things that agents sometimes do, because we didn't even really talk about this part, which is that if you have a real partnership, which my agent has done, which if you have a real partnership with your agent, similar to with your editor, but earlier in the process, maybe, they are your sort of anchor critiquer. It's not that other people can't give you useful feedback on your work, but it may be the case that you have the relationship. Not all agents, some agents are just like, yes, no, work on it some, but some of them really like do more developmental editing. Particularly, I keep hearing this now that developmental editors have less time to do developmental editing. I am lucky enough to have an editor who, as she said on our podcast, that'll be the last thing she gives up because she loves it so much, the developmental editing. But you know, editor agents in fact do a lot of that too.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. So that is a lot of what I would love to have in an agent, is someone who can like have those conversations with me about the book. So it's not a requirement, but I really appreciate it. I value it. So I really missed grad school when I had an advisor whose job it was to read my manuscript and give me feedback. Right.
Kind of the idea, right?
So
that's why that, again, like the analogy of it being like a marriage, like every time you have a relationship with particularly with short stories are more like a one night stand. I mean, or perhaps a fling. You're having a brief relationship, but then you know it's out there, and you go your separate ways. Maybe you'll meet up again. But having the continuity of having an agent who sees you across, I mean, maybe book publishing's in the middle, but having an agent who's, you know, the idea is for them to see you across many books, is like you have somebody who you have ideally a level of trust and so on. It's possible to have an agent who works well for you, even if you don't. I also know authors who don't really want editorial feedback from their agents. They're like, I know what I want to write. I don't really want yet another spoon in the pot. So they just really want someone who's going to do the business side, and that is also a perfectly reasonable relationship to have with an agent. But sometimes it's a literary partner, you know.
So then what happened with Russ is, so that book, I could see what his critiques were. I took it away to work on it some more. I started on a different novel that I'm still going to give him once I finish it. But, and here's where I'm thinking about maybe it's time to part ways soon, because the problem is that I write in multiple genres, right? And when I signed with Russ, you actually said to me that you didn't know that it was a good idea because Russ only does science fiction and fantasy, and he does it very, very well, but that's what he specializes in. And you thought I should have an agent who could represent all the stuff I do.
Well, I don't know that I said, I'm not sure that I
like
said
that?
Russ will not do that, but I said these are important questions to ask Russ. I have a suspicion that might not be his strong suit, and that might be something where let's make sure your expectations are aligned, because I know you, and what's going to happen when the next thing you know what I mean? Like now you're excited about a big blockbuster science fiction and fantasy thing, but maybe the next thing will be a slim cancer romance novella, and maybe the thing after that will be, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
Like, is he on board
Yes.
for
So
the wild,
so it turns out he's
circuitous rapids of your career? That's the
so
question.
it turns out he's not, except that he's,
And can he help?
well,
You know.
he's in fact fine with me having other agents to represent the other stuff, is where it's
Yeah.
turned out. So
Yeah.
if I want to write cookbooks, if I want to write picture books, if I want to write, romances, any of those things, and if I think another agent will do better by me, he has no problem with me having multiple agents. And that's a little uncommon, I want to say. Like some agents, maybe a lot of agents.
And possibly ironic, given that we just made this analogy to it being a
Yeah,
marriage, and given that you're known for
yeah. So a lot of agents, like
agent.
I talked to an agent about this recently, or a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, and he was sort of surprised that Russ was so willing to let me do that, because he says mostly an agent wants to represent all of you and not have you going and making money for other people, right? So
yeah, I think it's not the only time I've heard of it, but I think sometimes when genres are very distinct, like I think some people who do children's books, that's often such an esoteric field that they do have two agents. Or like sometimes people have literary versus a film agent. But a lot of times when it's as subtle as the difference between science fiction and romance, it's like, well, that's obviously going to generate a lot of confusion if you have any kind of science fiction. You've got romance in your science fiction, science fiction in your romance. Like how much counterfactual do you have to have before it's in,
Yeah. So I don't know. So that's kind of, so where I am right now is I feel like I don't have an agent who can represent the other things I do. I don't have a cookbook agent. It would be nice to have that. It would be, I indie published Feast and got a glowing review from Publishers Weekly, and have had TV and radio stuff that I've done, but it would be nice to be with a house, right, and have it not be indie, and then especially if with the follow-up cookbooks coming down the pike, vegan, etc. And then I've got a mainstream novel. I have a YA fantasy novel. These are written and they need to be, I'd like to show them to somebody and get feedback, and but they're ready to show an agent, right? And
can I just technical point that this may not be important, but from my point of view, your screen is like flashing with light. We should definitely cut this exchange, Darius. But it's like there's a flashy thing. I don't know why.
It's I think just the light flickering through from the sunlight outside.
Okay. Well, I don't know how important it is, but
I can do anything about it. Yeah.
Right, well,
Sorry about that.
It's okay. We'll put a warning on the YouTube for
that it's flickering. Yeah.
Might induce seizures. Anyway.
Yes.
Cut this part. Resume.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, the point being, I'm now feeling like I need to do a proper agent search. Say, here are the 5 books that I would like to sell. They're in all these different genres. I mean, there's picture books in there, among other things, right? There's a middle grade I've started. That one's not drafted yet. And some of it's like literary mainstream stuff. Some of it's genre. Some of it's, and I don't know where to begin. That's really I sort of very randomly asked Tamora Pierce, because one of the books is a YA fantasy. I was like, oh, and and she told me what agency she's with, but now what do I do next? So this is where I kind of want to hand it over to you and say, what would you do next? Or what did you do because I remember you had charts.
I do have charts.
You did research. So maybe this is helpful to me.
Well, we should talk about, I think there are 2 questions. Maybe first I should give so this is the portion where we're telling our story. I'll tell what I did, and then we can kind of do the figuring out, what you should do. So I have written short stories, wrote short stories exclusively for a long, long time. So I was working on novels, but I never got a novel to the point that I wanted to publish it for there were various drafts of novels lying around, but I've been publishing short stories for, quite a while, before I got ready to publish a novel. So that's another thing that maybe is worth saying for new writers. Like, you don't need an agent, certainly not in science fiction and fantasy, for short stories. And in fact, most agents won't even look at short stories. There's not enough money. It's not long-term relationship. It's not, it's just fine to just submit your stories unsubmittable. The only exceptions would be at the very top, I think, of literary field. Like you might have a better shot at the New Yorker or the Paris Review with an agent.
Well, I can tell you,
But
I'll pause and say what happened, which was interesting. When Bodies in Motion sold in a, 6-figure deal, as reported in in Publishers Weekly, is a good deal. My agent did actually get queries from the New Yorker and Virginia Quarterly saying, asking if I had short stories that they could look at. So that's the kind, and I sent them some stuff which they didn't publish, but that's the kind of situation where an agent might represent a short story.
And I think you can also say to your agent, "Hey, can you submit this to the New Yorker?" And you might get a better. You might get slightly more of a viewing than you would if you just submitted it over the transom. But most, just because I'm a pedant, you said a 5-figure number before, and now you said 6 figures.
Well, so that's interesting. It's a 6-figure deal. It was called a 6-figure deal because of escalator clauses. So,
so I don't know what that means. What's an escalator clause?
An escalator clause says if you sell, X number of copies in a certain amount of time, you get a larger chunk of money. And so because my contract had a couple escalator clauses, they were able to call it a 6-figure deal, even though it was not actually.
Yeah, that's not what you got, but it's what you could have gotten.
I guess it's a standard thing in the field. So if someone says they got a 6-figure deal, that might be what they mean.
Right. Cool. Anyway, so point being, you don't actually need, for the vast majority of short story sales, you don't need an agent, and it's not they aren't necessarily even interested or helpful for short stories. So when I was done with the unraveling, or so I thought, and wanted to ship it around. This was quite a few drafts ago. I mean, this is many years ago, really, at this point. I started looking for agents, and I specifically wanted to find agents, as I said before, rather than look directly for a publisher, because I thought that the kind of book that the unraveling would do well with being at a I didn't want to self-publish it. I wanted to bring it out from a publishing house, and partly because I didn't want to do it at work, and partly because I thought that I'm not going to be. I have a lot of friends who've been successful at indie publishing, and like one thing they are is prolific, which I am not. That just felt like the root of hardcover in a bookstore was good for this book, and I wanted to get an agent first, as I said, partly because I wanted to use the fact that this was a hard book to sell to find an agent who would be enthusiastic about it. I mean, it's an enthusiasm test. I'm basically saying, here's a book. And I think you said before it didn't seem like it would be a hard sell. I got very much the same response from a lot of different agents. Well, I got, I'm getting ahead of my story, but I will just say why I thought it was a hard sell. I thought it was a hard sell because it is a far future science fiction book full of massive speculative world building. And most books like that are space operas. Most books like that are, most sort of science fiction books with lots of extrapolation and crazy things far in the future and wild societies have like a MacGuffin and a big bad and spaceship battles. And this was one that basically for the first half of the book is an Ann Tyler story. I mean, it's a story of like, a family. I mean, it's my joke is that it's an Ian Banks novel set in an Ian M. Banks novel.
That's a good joke. I like
right?
it.
It's kind of an intimate domestic family story, 500,000 years in the future. Eventually the scale expands, but like that's, you have to have this combination of being willing to like plunge into this like gonzo world with all this world building going on to figure out what's going on, and also interested in like staying with this relatively small sort of like, can we get the kid dressed this morning, and like, should I hope my parents don't find out that I have a crush for like quite a while, like not just an introductory chapter before we get to spaceships shooting at each other, but like half the book. So and it's not the only book like that. I mean, I in a lot of Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, which is one of the big influences of the book by Samuel Delany, has that sort of vibe of like, we're just chilling with this far future family,
Mhm.
That was one reason it was a big influence. But that's the book that
Yeah.
arguably was one of the reasons that Delaney. You know what I mean? Like it
Right.
was when Delaney was writing Nova and Babel 17 and kicking out one of those every year or so. Like that was a very marketable publishing career,
Mm.
and like these big complicated books like Stars in My Pockets, like Grains of Sand and Dahlgren. Pretty soon after that, Delaney went to academia. So I'm not saying
I
it's
mean,
inevitable.
I do think it. I mean, those big books are the ones that I think really kind of made his career.
Yeah. I think they
So
certainly cemented his reputation, and I think Dahlgren also
yeah,
sold very well. But I also think that they were. I also think that would have been a hard sell, I guess is what I'm saying.
yeah.
Um, and anyway, the unraveling, and indeed, many people's reaction to the unraveling was like, "I love this book. I don't know how to sell it."
Mm,
It's not.
sure.
I think that when something's a hard sell, that doesn't mean it's not good, but that means that if you
Mm,
think in terms of like marketing and distribution, like there are well grooved paths. You know what I mean? Like if your book is kind of different enough to be interesting, but very much participating in a particular kind of thing that people know how to sell and they know how to shelve and they
sure.
know which reviewers would be good for it and so on and so forth. Like it's a, you know what I mean? And it's
Mhm.
predictable because partly, even if it's a predictable long shot, it's still sort of like they have something. If there's, one of the reasons they tell you when you're pitching a book to give comparable books, like it's similar to this, is that is that that's good for editors going into profit and loss meeting pitches, where they can be like, well, we can compare it to
Mhm.
they see books that are in a similar genre, they pick the one that did the best and they show that graph. You know what I mean? I'm imagining this. I've never been in such a meeting,
Mhm.
but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So it being comparable, comprehensible. So if it's doing something, rather weird, that makes it a hard sell, even if it's a good book. So,
Mhm.
um, and Dahlgren, which was a huge success, just to go back to that for a minute, was also a sleeper success. I mean, it
Was
wasn't
it? Yeah, I don't.
it was
Yeah.
seen as odd, and like it gradually accumulated like over time, but that's
Mm,
not but that, a book that's going to be weird and find its audience and maybe people are going to be really enthusiastic about is not necessarily a book that in a sort of large conglomerate publishing house. I mean, sometimes you have
yeah.
adventurous editors and whatever, but a lot of the times, uh, certain number of their slots, let's say, should be sort of for safe books that where there is a known audience for this and it's easy for the audience to find the book because they will recognize it instantly. You know what I
Right.
mean? As you said, you know what I mean? You as a kid would be like, dragon on the cover, I'm in, you know?
Mhm.
So there's a certain kind of dragon on the cover book, which it's like that is setting up a set of reader expectations, which it is pleasurable to fulfill. And
Yeah.
if it's a,
I
if
I
it's
have to say, like it. I'm sort of surprised. I can't think of any. You know how there's like the sci-fi book club and so on. That
uh-huh.
I'm sort of surprised there isn't anything that's a subscription for. Here are the weird books that publishers chose to put out, even though they don't fit into any marketing categories. Because I would think there would be an audience that would
Sure.
want to subscribe to that, right? I mean,
I think the problem with that is that everybody's notion of weird is slightly different. So, very often, I mean,
yeah.
what you see is on the mastheads of many, many magazines, they say, send us your stories that are too strange or oddball or quirky or
Hmm.
not, the things that don't fit. Because their sort of vision is that they are the quirky oddball ones and then the other people are sort of formulaic. But like most of those magazines, it's like when you actually submit a lot of stories to them and learn their taste, it's like, well, it's not everything that's quirky and oddball. It's their
Right.
particular take on quirky and oddball. So
Right.
anyway, uh, uh, so I knew that I wanted to find an agent, and I knew that the book was a good test of an agent's enthusiasm, because if they liked this book and were excited about selling it despite the pitfalls, that would be a good choice for me, because my career
Hmm.
was going to be weird and all over the place. And so I didn't want to go to an agent with a deal in hand from a publisher, because the agent might be like, well, this book's kind of weird, but whatever, he had already sold it.
Mm,
So that, not that they'd be just like, I'll take the easy money, because I didn't think that was the issue, but more the issue of like, well, I would be suspicious of this book, but it's proved itself. Like we've established, like he's already sold
mm,
it. So that establishes that there's a market for this book. So I'll take that for granted. I actually didn't want that yet. I wanted them to be looking at the book unsold, being like, what the
mhm.
hell am I going to do with this? And be excited about that problem, because that's the
Right.
agent that I needed. Um, so I did a very big agent search, and I sent it to both more science fiction fantasy agents and more literary agents. Um, And the other thing I did is I thought a lot about, so there's a book that I will recommend now, which is somewhat out of date because it's from the 90s and the publishing industry was very different in the 90s. And it's certainly not everything in it applies, but I was The Career Novelist by Donald Moss was a book that was published in the 90s and talked about the author and agent relationship and the ways that you create a career and work slowly towards it and so on. And the reason I say it's somewhat obsolete is because Donald Moss was a big agent then put out a book about a decade later called Writing the Breakout Novel, in which he spent the introduction sort of debunking like the first book still applied. He was basically like, remember how in the 90s I told you could start small as a midlist writer and like write one book and then gain a little more audience and then keep chugging along? Not so much anymore. Like, and he sort of talks about like, well, now the situation is much more that it's actually harder to sell a third book than it is to sell a first book because there's plenty of, because of the conglomerates unifying all the publishing houses and the way that works in terms of it all being one big spreadsheet for the bean counters, like they what they really are looking for is another massive success like Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, Hunger Games, that they can build an endless franchise on top of. And like they're willing to take a lot of roles for that. So it's actually not that hard to sell a first book if it looks like there's an outside chance it could be Hunger Games. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as long as it's sort of one that they can like recognize and be like, oh, that's in this mold, and that maybe it'll turn into a franchise. But if it doesn't hit big on the first outing, they're then much less like that. Once you become a known quantity, and they're like, okay, then even if your known quantity is like, oh, I have a couple of tens of thousands of avid readers who will buy this book, and perhaps that will slowly grow. That's far less interesting to them than it was in the 90s. That was his thesis anyway. Yeah. Might have changed again because that was a while ago too. But nonetheless, the first book, The Career Novelist, even though its vision of sort of gradually building up your midlist career is not quite as not the picture for that strategy isn't quite as rosy as it was in the 90s. It still is a really good overview, and I would recommend it nonetheless because it has a really good set of questions to ask yourself about what you want out of an agent, like what kinds of agents there are, the kinds of things agents do, and how you should reflect on your own career and think about like, what do I want an agent to do for me? What do I want that agent to be like? And there's a lot of so there's a lot of things that you may or may not want to, or that are trade-offs. So when you signed with Russ, I think I was like, yeah, he's known as in a good way a shark. I mean, he's a great white shark, right? He's like he goes after deals, he makes huge deals, he's aggressive in pursuit of his clients, he's a business guy, and that's both good and bad. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that is there's an axis that goes from an agent who is very commercial and very motivated by and whose thing is to go after like commercial properties and commercial deals, and that is good if that's what you want, and it also can become a conflict between you and that agent if that's not the game you're playing.
And can I want both? I think this is a lot of where I get stuck though, right? It's like I would be delighted to write a big commercial blockbuster that sells 1 million copies or 10 million copies, right? Like,
well, and
but I also like doing occasional weird quirky projects that have no chance.
Yes, I know. We're going to put "She Wanted It All" on your tombstone. I know. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's terrific that you want to. It is your stock and trade, and you should continue it. And we'll come in soon. Once I get done with my spiel, we'll consider your complex set of needs and the complex polyamorous agent situation that you may develop from it. In any event, it's a good book because it lays out those questions. Sure. And if you want some complex package of things, at least that you want some complex package of things, and that they may vary. There are also agents at the beginning of their careers who are young and hungry and want to sign people. There are agents who have a huge stable and are a little bit overflowing, so they have a lot of pull and a lot of connections, but maybe not so much time for you. I mean, that's
what you said about like the first book being easier to sell, and like there's so much potential with the first book, right? And there's like this could
Yeah,
go big, and it really
yeah,
to keep
yeah.
running the dating analogy, it reminds
hmm
me of the girl who like goes to the bar every Friday night because like this guy might be the one, this guy
Right,
might be the one,
right.
right? Like like
That's
they're all full
yes.
of potential.
The publishing industry is that dater who is
Yeah,
like, this could be the one. Yeah.
right.
Um. Anyway, um. The so how much attention you want from your agent, how much literary input you want from your agent. Do you want an agent who's a developmental editor or not? Do you
Hmm.
want an agent who's gonna be assertive or help you shape your career, or do you want one who's just going to sort of follow orders? And if you say, hey,
Mm,
sell this in this way, do you want one who's very responsive? Because I mean, an agent
mm,
only has so many hours in the day, so the more,
right.
if they are more responsive, that also means that that's what they're doing. I like a very
Right.
responsive agent, but I mean, I understand that somebody who's like a super higher powered agent is always having lunch with publishers. Maybe it gets back to you not as quickly. I
Quickly.
also have
Yeah.
noticed, I mean, not to throw any particular agent under the bus, but just having lots of friends go from being amateurs to neo pros to established pros and watching their ups and downs with their agents. Like, I think there is a pattern where a lot of agents who are really good agents and get a lot of deals done, but their personality type, which probably lends itself to being a good agent and getting a lot of deals done, is to go after the shiniest thing. You know what I mean? To sort of
Hmm.
pursue whatever's exciting right now. And that means that I've had a lot of people go through the cycle where for a while they're the shiniest thing and their
Right.
agent is selling them because that's what's working. And then after a while, like, maybe they stop being so shiny, and then it's a little harder to get the agent to return their calls, or the agent,
Right.
not that they're, I mean, sometimes the agent just ghost them. That's the worst case. But sometimes it's more just like, well, now they're on the back burner.
Right.
But that's not always the best thing for their careers. If you're the, you know what I mean? Sometimes if you've acquired the hot agent when you're the hot young thing, and then you end up on that agent's, in 40th place on that agent's list of clients and getting a commensurate amount of attention, maybe you're better jumping ship and going with someone who doesn't make mega deals, but who is actually going to be
Right.
more invested in your career. So, but maybe not. Not making a rule, but that's why I liked how that book laid out all these different axes to think about it on,
Right.
in terms of
Right.
and just explained a lot of stuff about what agents do, and it's a good overview.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, I made this spreadsheet, and because I'm that kind of nerd, and I made a lot of columns on this spreadsheet, and I tried to assess agents, much like one does with markets. We were talking
Hmm.
about having a spreadsheet of markets and being like, well, how much do I like how my story would appear in this place? How much money is it? How much prestige is it? How much circulation is it? Whatever, like all the things you could think about and
Hmm.
think about what matters to you. Similarly with agents, I wanted to sort of figure out, do they do science fiction? Do they do, how much, what are examples of things that they've handled, like the books that they've
Hmm.
sold? What authors do they represent? And then, like, as much scuttlebutt and like, whatever I could get out of all the authors about what their
Right.
relationship was with that agent. And and then I would sort of categorize them based on how much I thought they'd be a good fit, or I wanted them as agents. Again, about like, are they, and I would ask those questions, like, are they responsive? Like, are they good at making deals? Do they go after a lot of subrights? What are their strengths and weaknesses? I
Hmm.
would try to get a characterization of various agents, and I had like 100 agents in the spreadsheet eventually,
Hmm.
and then I would sort of prioritize them and kind of send things out. Mostly with agents, you can do simultaneous submissions, as long as, unlike with a lot of science fiction markets,
Right.
as long as you tell them. But sometimes they do ask, and it does matter. And if you say I'm sending it to 100 people, they may not be as
Right.
enthusiastic. So I would usually be only sending it to a few at a time, and I would basically be like, and they would ask, and I'd often, often they'd ask who else is looking at it, and I would say, and generally they're cool with that. They would generally say, like, as soon as, like, let me know if they make you an offer, because often that is
Right.
what happens, is that they sometimes, very busy agents, will get around to reading your book because someone else made an offer, and they're like,
Right.
oh god
Sure.
damn, I never got past chapter 3 because I put it down. I better hurry up and finish this and find out if I want
Hmm.
to counteroffer. Um, so so I worked through the list, and I got a lot from the literary people. I tended to get a lot of uh, this is amazing writing, but I have no idea what's going on in this book. I'm not the agent for this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for the science fiction people, I would often get like, this is great real world building and it's a cool setting, but nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, is exactly what that's because it's an Ian M. Banks novel, an
Yeah.
Ian Banks novel set in an Ian M. Banks novel.
Right.
And then I would get, you know, and then a bunch of people who were kind of in the middle would say, I love this, it's amazing, I have no idea how I would sell it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of, I ended up eliminating a bunch of the 100 agents. Some of them I never got to or never responded. I think I got at least like 30 some rejections.
Mm-hmm.
One agent who I worked with, oh, and also I was doing a lot of sourcing of agents, and the way I was sourcing agents is, first of all, looking in the backs of books at the acknowledgments to find out what agents there even were. Also looking at the SIFWA directory, which tells you something about who represents whom, if you're a member of the science fiction writers of and fantasy writers of America. And asking everybody I knew, and like, you know, just asking around, and you know, as you said, what do you think of your agent? But sort of I would dig deep about like, are they good at this? Are they good at that? How quickly do they respond to you, and so on. I actually got in quite a bit of trouble.
Oh no.
This is a learning curve experience. It took me so long to go through this process that I was accumulating stuff in the data, and I would put like by the note, I started putting like the year that I had received this information. But in the beginning, I was just sort of piling a bunch of stuff in there. And I made a terrible mistake on a mailing list. I was on one of those mailing lists of a bunch of science fiction writers, many of whom were more senior than me, because, you know, I knew them from some peer workshop. And, well, I mean, I wouldn't say more senior. We're about the same amount of time in the field, but I've been writing short stories while they were writing novels. So at this point, they were like pros. They were like seasoned pros. And I, you know, it seemed obvious to me as common sense that if I'm sort of speaking openly, even to like 20 people, I shouldn't like repeat bad scuttlebutt. Like I shouldn't like trash somebody. Like even if somebody had told me in confidence some bad thing about their agent, that it would be bad for me to like repeat that bad thing. Like I know that I you know, have gone to kindergarten. But what did not occur to me was that saying something positive was
still
potentially
privileged.
equally bad.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, I know that so-and-so likes so-and-so or whatever. Like I was mentioning that in passing, and I got a email from the author being like, what the fuck? Like I just had this bad breakup with that agent. So your information is way out of date. Like now I basically am in the position of having to correct, to have let what you said stand, in which case you have me praising this person I just had a bad breakup with, or to, you know, publicly come out and say, no, that agent sucks. So that was a learning experience. Be very vigilant.
Yeah. It's like when your friends break up, and you know, how do you navigate that? Right? Like it can be touchy, right? Like it's
yeah. I mean, I didn't even know the agent, but it's actually there is an interesting, appropriate Talmudic story about lashon ra, which is gossip, which is like a huge deal. Like that's one of the biggest sins. And they're very concerned. It's a very social society in which there are no. This is a distributed nation which is ruling itself by opinions, and there's no kings and police. So gossip is a big deal. And so they say at one point they mention this time where this guy said, like, King Saul comes trying to find David, or trying to find a priest that he's going to kill or something, and the guy says, like, did this guy anoint David or something? And the guy said, oh yes, he did. And they break this down to categories of like, it was something true that he said, it was something good, it wasn't a bad thing, it was a good thing that he had done it, and it was, you know, already I believe it was like already public, he had done it in public. So it was like, even if it's true and it's positive and it has been observed in public, still the guy got essentially, you know, he ended up, like, by telling him that this other guy had done it, he was making that guy got murdered. Because anyway, the point is, it's a very strict set of rules. So even things that are positive, this has been a slight digression on confidentiality.
But I think it's what I would pull out of that is a little bit you know, you've got to be careful with it, but this is the very valuable inside information. I mean, this is, you know, my students are often very resistant to the idea that they have to network in order to sell their stuff, right? They want to write good stories and send them out and get published. And that can sometimes happen, but you know, humans are humans, and going and talking to the other humans about what's going on. Oh, look, it's the title of our podcast. We're humans, but is can be very helpful. And that,
Rosenbaum, Meron, and Rosenbaum are social mammals.
yes, and gossipy. I mean,
Well,
like,
and you know, and that's obviously okay. You have to be take things with a grain of salt because it's only one person's opinion, and you don't want to, you know. I mean,
yeah,
many people have, you know, obviously people's impressions are going to be colored by their own reactions. You're never going to find. I mean,
right.
I mean, an agent who nobody anywhere has anything bad to say about may just not have been doing enough because they're going to step on some toes at some point. But you know, you
Sometimes
want to
this is
form an
crucial
impression.
information that could
Yeah.
save you years, right?
And you
Like,
can have a career.
yeah,
Just again, you can sit in your room and just send out emails and
yeah,
never talk to anyone. That is perfectly possible. But then you will be making all of your own mistakes and garnering all that experience personally by yourself.
right.
The advantage of treating it as a communal enterprise is that you pool some of that experience. So anyway, I made this big spreadsheet. I worked my way through it. At one point, I talked to an agent who liked the book a lot and who had actually pretty great recommendations for revising it. Who was, you know, in sympathy with its sort of balance between the literary and the science fictional, and gave me this feedback. And I went and spent, because it's me, I spent like at least a year, like I basically paused my agent search and did a revision for this agent who wanted to look at again if I could do these things. And essentially, I was, you know, essentially she had really good advice about like increasing the level of conflict and raising the stakes. So basically my mantra for that revision was like more Hunger Games, like more, not in the sense of like big best-selling thing, but strictly actually literally Hunger Games, like make there be more malevolent bad guys, make the eye of the public, you know, on this event be sort of more like this invasive thing that raises the stakes, and so on and so forth. Make it, and you know, make it more dystopian, although not exclusively dystopian, because it's a mixture. It's both utopian and dystopian. But like, let the teeth bite, like which was very much good advice because it was very much in line with what I was already doing in crafting a somewhat utopian world and then thinking which characters suffer, you know. But like, this agent had a really good point that I was like sort of pulling my punches and that I should, you know, if these are the characters who are going to suffer, let them suffer. And so I did a lot of that was very helpful. Even though after I'd done it, the agent still ended up saying no.
Oh,
so
no.
that can happen.
Yeah.
But you know, that took quite a while. So eventually I found my current agent, John Silbersack, and I liked his reaction a lot because he read the book and then he was like, well, we need to have a call. And we had this call and he was basically like, so you know this is a hard sell, right? And I was like, yes, I do know that. He was like, good. I just wanted to make sure. That interests me.
Right.
And I was like, that's good. And interestingly, I sort of feel like I'd been assuming that the person I needed was like young and hungry agent who was like filling out their stable. But in fact, you know, John Silversack is this very veteran agent who was a publisher for a long time and I don't know, founded some label back in the day. I don't want to say the wrong one, but was important in making some of these imprints as an editor and then became an agent and has been an agent for a long while. So had a lot of experience. And I think that was actually helpful in the sense that he was very undaunted by this being, you know, he was not like, because some of the younger agents I talked to who were very, and I don't want to make this about a age thing, but I do feel some of the less experienced agents who I talked to were like excited about the premise of the book, which is like, I just don't know how I would approach the selling this. And he was like, oh, one of these, eh? So anyway, that has pros and cons like anything, but that seemed like the vibe that I liked, and he had very good suggestions too. Then I did another revision for him, and then I eventually sold it. I mean, as I said, it's not. I already knew Liz, of course. Like I sold it to somebody who I'd been hanging out with for years, so it's not that. In this case, it wasn't the contacts that were so important, but nonetheless, having somebody involved to do the you know, the contractual stuff and the business stuff and think about that's very helpful because it's going to be a lot of go rounds and that could be kind of frustrating. And also if I were going through and being like, oh, well, do you really need these sub rights or whatever? Like I would feel like, oh, I'm doing this instead of writing. You know what I mean? Like having him keep me in the loop, he's very responsive, but to be doing that was very helpful, even though it was an editor I knew. But I mean, maybe
Right.
even more so because it's an editor I knew,
Well,
because I want my relationship to Liz to be all fun and creativity and excitement. And
and
if we have a fight, I want it to be about the book, not
yeah.
about the contract.
And I want to give people an example of like why the subrights thing is important, because I don't think I understood this as a new writer.
Yeah.
So with Bodies in Motion, when I sold that 2-book contract, they took the book to the German book fair, the big
Mm-hmm.
international
Mm-hmm.
book fair, and tried to sell foreign rights to it. And it sold translation rights in 6 countries
Mm-hmm.
before it ever came out in America, in the
Yeah.
US, right?
Yeah.
And it sold through that $25,000 advance in foreign rights. Germany paid $8,000, and
Mm-hmm.
Germany, I think, pays the most, then the UK, then it kind of goes down from there. Serbia, I want to say, paid like $500, right? But
Mm-hmm.
regardless, like that gave me such a buffer in
Yeah.
terms of what happens when it came out in the US, and success breeds success,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when people are willing to plop down money for this kind of thing, then maybe other people are paying more attention to it too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
uh,
and um there's lots of interesting intricacies there. I don't know how much we want to go into. There, with subrights, there is the question of what you want your publisher to have and what you want to retain. Like
right.
whatever you're giving in that case, it sounds like the publisher, who had this was a flagship book, they were spending a bunch of money on it and so
Right.
on, and they were interested in going and shopping around the
Mm-hmm.
subrights, which they would then get, I don't know, typically 50% of or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's also possible that you retain the rights and that your agent sells those subrights.
Right.
Again, the agent usually in that case gets more than like 15%, because if
Mm.
they're selling subrights themselves, then maybe they get 20-25%.
Right.
But
Right.
depending on what it is. But that's the question there is who is going to be more. Some of the question there is who's going to be better at selling the rights.
Mm-hmm.
And also we're not just talking about translations, but also about audio and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's
Right,
also
right,
film and TV, but that's always kind of a long shot unless
right.
it's like a huge splash. But that's also a possible thing. But certainly things like translations and audio
Mm-hmm.
and various other things are often quite common and matter. And so that's why when you talk to your agent, you want to also know what kinds of deals they have. What also, like, are they a solo agent or are they in an agency? Often if they're in an agency with different people, like there's a subrights person, and maybe your agent is more about having lunch in New York, but the subrights agent is more about having lunch in Frankfurt and
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood. I don't know. So knowing, and that's the thing. You can also, if you're trying to get information from your friends or people and say, are they good at subrights?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my general take on the subrights in negotiating the book was like, hey, I'm willing for the publisher to have whatever subrights they're actually going to use. Like if
Mm-hmm.
they have a plan for selling in the UK, let's give them a shot. You know what I mean? It also
Right.
doesn't have to be forever. You could say you have a year to try and sell it in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when people write contracts, they're just stacking up everything they can think of, and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
are you actually going to do anything with these rights? If not, maybe the agent will. So that's about subrights. Anyway,
Yeah, sorry, I redirected us there.
no,
I
that's
think
quite
I
all
think
right.
I think you were kind of wrapping your agent search
Yeah,
and how you
and
found.
then I will say, I don't know when this podcast is going to air, and I don't know if this isn't entirely public, but it's true that I had basically already had the relationship with Liz, but it also is true that since then, my agent has done some other stuff which I wouldn't have done, and subright stuff that I don't have any necessarily connection to. So I didn't want to make it sound like I did all the selling, because after the book sold to Liz, there's some other stuff that I think I'm about to sign.
Knock on wood.
But I'll be opaque about that. Anyway,
Yes.
so that is that was my story, and that was much more. I mean, in contrast to your story, where it's kind of like you asked a friend and they hooked you up with their agent. This was this very methodical,
mine was
big
very
spreadsheet
haphazard.
search.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think those represent two typical modes. I mean, I think
Yeah.
many people are sending out a million emails, and then sometimes people are just like, it happens serendipitously because there are all those connections, and you
Yeah.
do, and because if your friend is really passionate about your
Yeah.
work and their agent is looking and loves their work, then it's not
Yeah.
unreasonable.
I will also say, like, the connection with Russ was with it was a writer I was talking to at a party. We weren't friends. We didn't know each other. We had just had like a good hour-long conversation about his book, which I really liked.
Right.
And that was, he hadn't read anything of mine, right?
Right.
But I think from the conversation, I think you could sort of, you know.
I mean, and I think that, so again, I don't want to unleash a tidal wave of people going and insisting, going at, like, Marianne's dating analogy is a good one. Be chill, people. But at the same time, like, it's not unreasonable that you might be like, oh, this person sounds really cool. Maybe my agent would be interested in talking to them too. You're not, your agent's going to say yes or no in the end. It's not.
And there is something satisfying about hooking people up too.
Yes.
There is, if you make a good marriage, it's very satisfying.
That's right.
All right. So now you got to tell me, we should wrap this up. What am I supposed to do next?
Okay, well, I think so. Let's think about this for a moment. I mean, I think in some ways that what you need to do is, well, I would say this. You should think about all these different pieces of your career and what you need an agent for, which parts you need an agent for, and what you want that agent to do for you, right? So with cookbooks, like, I don't know anything about the cookbook market. Like, how important is an agent? How much effort would it save you if there was an agent approaching publishers versus you approaching publishers?
Let me give you a data point to factor in. For my picture books and for this memoir, the cancer log that I kept during treatment, both of those have editors, small press editors, who would like to publish them, right? And so I could just keep doing that kind of thing. It would, and I wouldn't need.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about Russ. Is Russ willing to, like, even if he's only interested in selling science fiction and fantasy, is he willing to review small press contracts and, like, you know what I mean, and, like, be the contact person, or do you think that's not worth it because it's not?
I mean, I think he probably would, but I think it's
not.
I don't think it would be super helpful. I mean, the small press contracts are usually very simple and straightforward. Sure. They don't have all the stuff that the big presses have. So, so
there aren't usually subrights to cookbooks. Although there's probably audio.
Well, no, there are for the big publishers, but the small press, it's just generally a very simple contract, right? Like my contracts with Circlet and Lethe were almost nothing, right? Like a page of stuff. So I think that's where I am, is like, I have some books that editors are interested in, and I don't know whether I should just, like, I'm fine with having a hybrid career where I do some big press, some small press, some indie. I think there's a lot of value to, like, sometimes you have projects that are not well suited to big presses, right? And for a variety of reasons. And I think the field has gotten more understanding about that. And and more I meet people who present themselves as hybrid authors in the sense that they do different types of publishing. But I guess I would like an agent who would look at all these things and tell me which ones, this you should have, this one, go ahead and do small press. I don't see a lot of commercial big potential for it. This one, but it's an interesting indie project or whatever, right? This one would be a good commercial. I want someone to look at, like, 10 different books of mine and tell me this. So,
I mean, what you really want, it sounds like it doesn't sound like there are specific burning projects now that you can't sell because you don't have an agent.
Right.
It's more like what you're missing is this sort of big picture partnership view where you want someone who with the business expertise to be able to do that in all these different fields.
And ideally someone who reads widely,
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is it's entirely possible that you can find, like, the ideal person who combines all this stuff. It's not impossible. It's perfectly possible that there's an agent out there who's super eclectic. But there are some things that mitigate against that being a common case, because for you to write each of these things, you know what I mean? You're going and writing each of these things in many different fields. The agent has to be conversant enough to be useful. The agent doesn't just have to have written 3 cookbooks, but to have sold 100 cookbooks, right? I mean, and so they need to have, like, this sort of business expertise that they get from deep immersion in all the different fields to be able to say anything useful other than, I don't know how to handle that, you should ask somebody else.
Right.
And so one thing that is an interesting question is that you might want an agent or a set of agents, or potentially like an agency that handles
Yeah.
a variety of things. It may still not handle everything. Like I think you could
Right.
certainly get, I mean, I think there certainly are, agents who handle both literary stuff and science fiction stuff and romance stuff. I think there are certainly agencies that have people who are strong in science fiction and other people who are strong in literary or romance and who trade off depending on the
Mm-hmm.
book. And I think that, you know, some of them might do cookbooks and children's books and so on, but that might be a different neck of the woods. But to some extent, it's like, it's worth distinguishing between the kind of person that you want where you can have a conversation with them where they are acting as a sounding board and a general person who knows something about the publishing industry, where they could say, oh yeah, my impression of cookbooks is this, versus them having enough sophistication to actually be like a player in cookbook
Yeah.
agenting.
Right.
And so I think you maybe need to figure out for which of these genres you need just an, it sounds like you're feeling the lack of a general advisor who's going to cheer you on
Mm-hmm.
in all of these fields. That person doesn't necessarily have to have amassed the sophistication to sell well in each of these fields. Some of those things you still might be on your own or need another agent,
Right.
but it sounds like you want that overview. I think that's what your heart yearns for, is the person who would be just totally looking at your whole career with you and be an agent.
Well, and part why that's helpful is helping me prioritize, right?
Yeah.
Because, if someone knows here are the 10 projects that Marianne has in various stages of completion, which ones should she work on next? That would be useful for me.
I mean,
I could throw.
I have a big caveat. There's a big caveat here, which is
Yeah.
I'm overreaching my remit, and it would be great if we get agents calling in who listen to this podcast and are like, "Screw you, I can be Marianne's everything." But that would be a wonderful result.
That would be great. Call us.
I am a bit suspicious that unless someone is precisely the polymath that you need, but they were a cookbook editor, and then they were a science fiction editor, and literary editor, and a romance editor, and children's book editor, and now they've decided to open an agency, which is possible, but that it's going to be difficult for them to answer that, in the sense that they are naturally going to have a bias. Like the thing they do is naturally going to seem to them like the thing you ought to do. And even if they're self-aware about that, they're not going to know how to, you know what I mean? Like, how should they know? And in fact, also, you want to do everything, because it says she wanted it all on your tombstone. And an agent is reasonably going to suggest to you that what will make you money is to cultivate some line of work where you can provide repeated benefit to some set of customers, which, I think there's a lot of fans out there listening to this podcast who are just fans of Marianne and all her works, but it's going to be scalable and marketable to do like your line of X rather than one each every 10 years. So to some extent, the person who's going to look into your soul and tell you which project you should pursue next is maybe a little closer to a therapist than an agent. But I'm not saying you should despair on the notion of an agent search. I just think you should be. I just think at the end you may have to make some choices about, what do I want this person or these people to be really specialized in, and also to what extent do I just want them to be a person who has a good listening ear and is. You currently have a great white shark known for commercial success and muscle and unerring wisdom, and it isn't. I don't know if that is necessarily. You have a good relationship with him, but is he a hand holder? Is he a hand holder across all genres? You know what I mean? Like,
he's definitely not across all genres. He's been great in science fiction. I think he's given me lots of really good and useful feedback. So I
think there are agents who see as part of their remit. I don't think there's going to be an agent who is going to. Maybe there is, but unless they have this unicorn level of sophistication across all of these various different things, I think it's not going to be the same as having a conversation with Russ about science fiction, where he's so deeply knowledgeable that he's going to be. But I think there are probably agents who see, probably increasingly nowadays, agents, because they're hybrid authors, agents who see having a mind meld with you about your whole career and what matters to you, even if some of it they can't make any money
Yeah.
of, represent you for, don't know anything about, but nonetheless, like, they're willing to look at the big picture with you. Maybe that's a stock and trade.
It's a big ask. I mean, I really I sort of feel like, and I don't know, maybe nobody does this, right? Like, rather than give people like one book to sell, what I would really like to do, I mean, I could start with that, right? Like,
Sure.
here's the one book I think you're most likely to like, but after that, what I'd like to do is give them at least like 20 pages of 10 different things and ask them
I
to
think a
look
lot of
at it.
agents do that. I mean, I think a lot of agents
Yeah.
are quite willing to be opinionated about what. I mean, I think they often want to
Yeah.
hear, like, what are all your projects that you're working on, like what
Right.
kinds of things you work on, because they don't want to just sell one book. They want to have an ongoing
Right.
relationship. So if this is the last book you're ever going to write in that genre, they want to know that. So,
Yeah.
but a first book is the most tangible thing they can make a decision based on. So
Right.
they're
Right.
not gonna. They typically need something that's finished and ready to go to market in order to make a decision.
Right.
An agent is generally not going to take you just on your having being able to write well and having lots of good ideas, because they can't do anything
Right.
with that yet.
Exactly.
So they're going to wait
Yeah,
until the
yeah.
moment they have something to sell. But they are interested in all the other things you haven't written yet, typically. And I think probably that there are maybe increasingly agents who are willing to look beyond just what can they sell, but also to, like, being a little bit more your therapist, of, like, your career therapist. Or perhaps there will be after this podcast.
That's
Although structurally there is, of course, the issue of, like, they get paid on commission on the things you sell through them. So it's kind of a conflict of interest if they tell you to do. I mean, if they tell you to do things indie, that's because they don't think it. From a financial perspective, that's because they don't think it's worth their time to bother with that, which is fine, or because they think it'll build your name and reputation, which will help your other books. Anyway, but I don't think such a person is impossible to find. But I do think that you need to know what you're looking for, and I think that you and this is not just for you, but for everybody who's listening, know what you're looking for, and also take into consideration that it is a difficult, arduous process. It is a courtship. You are trying to, you're trying to arrange a marriage. And so, there's all these factors, and it takes time. And so I think to some extent, I mean, there's different levels of how invested in something you can be. You don't have to, like, have a spreadsheet and a pie chart of how many things you've sent out if you don't want to. There is some use to just sort of deciding what you want and declaring it. I mean, just the fact that you're having a podcast where you're like, this is what I would like, that certainly could be helpful. And if you're, if you tell all your friends and you're at the bar and you're like, oh, this is what I'm looking for. But and then it may happen serendipitously, as other things have happened. But also you could do kind of a methodical search. The other question is whether you need a general cheerleader, or whether you need to supplement Russ by having, like, if you have some specific clusters of projects that are like, this is the literary romance stuff, this is the children's stuff, that maybe, I mean, it is hard to find an agent who will only take part of the stuff. I mean, Russ is rare in that regard, and I think that if Russ is like, I'm not going to sell your romance stuff, that does beg the question of, how many kisses versus how many ray guns are in a given book, if it goes to your romance agent or your science fiction agent, right? Like,
we really have got to do a podcast about RWA, because I want to talk to you about all of this. I'm going to write up my whole, I went to the RWA retreat, and I have many thinky thoughts about.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear about that. Anyway, but I think that, I don't know if what I'm saying is helpful, but I'm basically saying, I think there's this sort of coach role that you could be looking for. And there's this sort of agents for different domains approach that you could take. Again, sometimes, like, if they're in an agency together, there's a little overlap between those two. And then I think you could be doing the same thing we just talked about doing, where you ask everybody, and I mean, one thing that I would say in your case is, who else is like this? Like, who are successful writers who are a little bit more, farther along than you, maybe. Or not. I mean, because this whole hybridity is relatively new. So I don't know if there are people 20 years older who have, I mean, maybe they do.
I mean, honestly, it's a little tricky thinking of other people who do quite so many different things as I do. Like, there are people, who turn out a different kind of book every time they do a book. And I'm thinking about Vikram Seth or Roxane Gay, but they're still mostly within literary fiction, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
Each
Well,
book
there's
is
certainly people who go between mediums, who go from
yeah,
comics to, I mean, like Ta-Nehisi
yeah,
Coates.
right.
Who's Ta-Nehisi Coates' agent?
Yes. Well, yeah, that's how it's sort of like I should find out, right? So,
but yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I think well, and it's entirely possible that Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't have anything to say about writing Black Panther comics,
yeah, yeah,
except Godspeed,
yeah,
because but sometimes people do have different sets of agents for different things. I mean,
yeah,
certainly I
yeah.
think people who go between primarily written and primarily audiovisual media often
Hmm.
have two sets of agents, like people who are in, but
Right.
um, but yeah, maybe ask around people who
Yeah.
do a lot of things and say, how do you do all these things, and how do you
Right.
decide what to do amongst all the things, um, and and I think sort of like allocate. I don't know. I wouldn't. It isn't a funny kind of search, and it does seem like you do need to land an agent, either in addition to or instead of your current agent. You need to have some specific, it does need to coalesce around some specific project, even if
Yeah.
your desire is to tell them all the myriad things, and even if indeed you that's really kind of a litmus test,
Right.
or which things can they do. You do have to decide which is the sort of thing you're going to lead with. That's the sort of emblematic one.
Right.
And maybe that's how you pick your next project, is you pick a project where if an agent would take that, they're probably the right agent.
Right.
Um, that might be a worthwhile way to approach it. That a project that either complements what Russ does or expresses all the complex hybridity that you're
Right.
talking about. Um, yeah, but I think you will find that if you do make a list and contact people and have something to shop around that is the emblematic thing,
Hmm.
I think you'll find that this is not too hard to assess. Like that you
Right.
can lay this out for them and figure out which parts they are willing to do, and in whether that's going to be helpful to you,
Yeah.
and how. And I guess one of the main factors here is what you have now a situation which, when you look at all the things you want to write, some of them you're sort of more reluctant to tackle because you don't feel like you have the same kind of backing, I guess, is the, you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
or I'm not sure, maybe that should be phrased as a question. Like, do you feel like tackling a literary novel that Russ is not going to represent, it feels like more of an uphill climb, because then you'd have to,
Oh,
um,
I don't know. I think
maybe not.
I can be pretty enthusiastic about all my projects at the same time. Like, so I have the
I sense
arrange
a theme.
yeah, so like the arrangement
Yeah.
I is the mainstream novel. I think I'm probably going to be working on that this fall.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the big science fiction novel that
Mm-hmm.
I'm 50,000 words in. I'm enthusiastic about that. But you just can't write them all simultaneously, you know? So
Figure out which is your
at
Monday
least I
project and which is your
can't. So
Tuesday project.
yeah,
No,
that's
yeah,
right.
that's
So
there's a lot of loss there. It is actually helpful
yeah,
to be on a roll with one thing.
yeah. So
Well,
anyway.
I think that, but I mean, so it sounds like you need to commit to one of them to do first, and if that one is the science fiction
Hmm.
one, then, although it's sometimes hard to predict how the mind will work, like maybe you will get stuck on one and want to switch to another. But if
Right.
the science fiction is one, then this is not an urgent problem, because that is one that Russ can sell. And if it's the literary one, then that presents a perfect opportunity to be like,
Right.
well, now what do I do with
Now it's
this?
time to look for a lit
And start
agent. Yeah.
having conversations around it. And I don't know, like, because the situation is so odd. I don't think this is a very orthodox thing to do, but I'm almost tempted to say it would be cool if you had two different things, like a weighty literary novel, and then like I don't know, some completely different, then like a children's book,
Hmm.
but again, children's books are kind of their own little world, and you
Yeah. Yeah.
often don't find an agent to do both. But anyway, if you found perhaps like the arrangement and
Passions. Again,
passions,
I gotta rewrite
like
that
the
memoir
nonfiction,
again.
like
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
meaty, public
Yeah.
intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates' agent, nonfiction piece, and a literary novel would be two things that you could reasonably assume the same agent might represent.
Right. Right.
Something that would be spur a conversation about, so how many things do you do? Both are distinct enough from Russ's bailiwick that, not much overlap there. Yeah. So, and it's probably worth asking Russ where the border is of what he will represent.
Yeah, and I do. I mean, I do. I just run things by him, and I'm like, do you want to look at this? Do you not want to look at this? Right.
But yes,
yeah.
Sure, and that works as long as he's your only agent. But I guess what I'm saying is, before you go to find a romance agent,
right.
the romance agent is going to ask, so which things am I not allowed to represent? Is any paranormal romance does that mean Russ has first look? Does Russ have first look? Like, does he, you know what I mean? Like, if you write a paranormal romance, does the romance agent only get to see it if Russ is sit? No?
Yep.
I mean, that's I
like that you're jumping ahead to the point where I do have another agent. So that's nice. You're very confident. So,
well, I feel like you have to. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. You might end up staying with Russ and realizing that you have to do a bunch of the stuff yourself. You may end up changing to a primary agent who's a coach who works in an agency where they can offload a lot of things that aren't their specialty. You may have Russ and then some other agents that supplement it, particularly if it's like cookbooks and children's fiction where they wouldn't be interested at all in these other things, or maybe even if it's like literary fiction and nonfiction. I think romance is the one where it's like, don't get too
stuck on romance. I'm not at all sure I want to write romance. Sure. So,
but also literary, I think also with literary fiction, the same thing could arise. I guess the question is, I think the agent, when you sit down to talk to them, they will be asking. You will want to know what you're open to, and they will be asking, what do you need? And the reason that people don't usually do two agents is because trouble will arise where something is in a fuzzy borderland.
Right. No, I agree. And that takes us back to the dating thing. Communication is key in poly relationships.
And obviously you have a lot of you have a strong skill set built around this issue. So that should probably be transferable knowledge.
Hopefully we didn't get too much into the weeds with my stuff, and this is useful to other people. I do think, especially with my students, they're often experimenting, and so they are writing in lots of different genres, and they do have these questions. So I kind of want to say, don't do what I'm doing, because 25 years in, you're going to be
don't be like me and Marianne if you can avoid it.
That's right.
If you want to have writing as a career and you can manage to reliably and efficiently reward your readers with the same kind of pleasure over the course of many years in the same kind of form, that will probably help.
That will probably help you build a career, yes.
But, if not, then welcome to our family.
That's right. We'll sympathize at the very least. The ice cream is over here. Okay. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thanks for letting me drag you into my therapy session and business advice
as always
session. And we'll be back with more stuff. We need a tagline. We need a sign off. I don't know what it is. So
stay human.
Stay human, I guess so.
Or not.
Or not. All right.